Mhm.
Okay.
Oh.
We're here. We're on.
Oh, I'm sorry. I missed a little person. Oh, hey, live. Sorry. Hey.
Episode 252.
I know.
Come on.
Yeah, but did you remember the bell? Because you're clearly not in Chicago. All right. So calling Rick Byer in.
I'm in London, England.
No, you're not. I'm in
London,
England.
UK. Yes.
Oh, you're much more downtown than I am, I bet.
And where are you, Chris? Calling Chris Anderson in.
I'm in Windsor again.
Windsor.
Still in Studio W2 because Studio W1 is my daughter's bedroom at the moment.
Well, I'm in studio on the road. So OTR, Studio OTR. And welcome everybody to History Happy Hour. Thanks to Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours for helping to bring you this show. Check out their rich offering of military history tours at StephenAmbroseTours.com.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And whether you're watching live, watching on replay, or listening on the HHH
podcast.
Oh, nice. We're glad to have you here. And today we'll be talking once again about D-Day. So let us know what you're drinking, and we'll discuss our drinks later when we get our guest on here. And Chris, I want to mention here, it's an important thing for me to mention that today is my 39th wedding anniversary.
Congratulations. That's not London.
And no, that's Chicago. And it is the fourth wedding anniversary in a row that I have not spent with my wife.
Oh, just 4? Please.
I know. I'm sorry. I'm a piker. But next year's going to be our 40th wedding anniversary. So I'm not going to do a D-Day tour.
Really?
Well, that's what I've told the office. So we'll see how the scheduling works out. So yeah, hopefully we'll make that happen.
Well, congratulations.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm excited. Next year's 40. We don't want to wait to celebrate to 50 because who knows if we're going to make 50. So, I'm still on probation. You never know how these things.
You never know. The light bulb will finally go off.
Right. Hey, Chris, we should thank everybody who supports us on Patreon, especially our top shelf patrons. And, you could join this group.
That little spot down there at the bottom?
Yeah, under Dan Modes. We could fit one more, or maybe you're a $5 a month patron and you want to up to the big top shelf, play in the big leagues. I don't know, if you're out there, if you're interested in that. You can join this group by going to patreon.com/history happy hour. Chris, what do we have in the way of guests? Can you tell me?
Yeah, I mean, Susan Yu is joining us, and Wally Morrison again. Ron, who is actually sipping a glass of Riesling in Leipzig, which sounds very nice. Ken from Kansas.
Give me some more.
Gene Templin has joined us, and Lynn. So Lynn and Wally are going to tag team. Yeah, good.
Excellent. Well, do you want to get started?
The
should we
fingertips are ready. The fingertips are ready.
Well, give us a cue, and we'll get going.
Oh, see, there you go. I feel better.
There you go. The bar is open.
Thank God.
So we're on D-Day for the third week in a row, probably fitting, as the invasion of Normandy was one of history's greatest military triumphs, and we're approaching the 81st anniversary. And today we're going to talk with Garrett Graff, who's the author of When the Sea Came Alive. It's a book that looks at D-Day through the eyes of those who experienced it, from soldiers, nurses, pilots, children, neighbors, sailors, politicians, volunteers, photographers, reporters, and many more. And Garrett is a journalist, a historian, a producer, and a speaker. He taught at Georgetown University. His writing has appeared in publications like the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, New York, Bloomberg. He's written a number of books. His book, terrific book, Watergate, A New History, was a Pulitzer Prize finalist. Garrett Graff, welcome to History Happy Hour.
Hey, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, it's our great pleasure. Did you happen to bring a cocktail to this event?
I did. I am a Scotch drinker, and so I have my Lefroy right here.
Oh,
and Chris, did you bring one?
I did. Glenturk 12, and I realized the bottle's empty, so this is the last. I have to get another one.
Oh
you?
my gosh. Yeah, so I have, oddly enough, here in London, I have a Goose Island IPA, which is a Chicago beer. That's what they
Homesick?
had in the bar. No, not yet. But it's not my first one of the evening. So,
Oh, okay. Good.
sick is still a possibility. Garrett, listen, welcome to History Happy Hour. I guess the first question has to be for us, why another D-Day book? In the author's note at the beginning, you give a nod to all the books that have been written about D-Day, and you say, among and across so many histories, there turns out to be a fuller and richer story waiting to be told. So why another D-Day book, and what is that story?
Yeah. So the story of D-Day for me actually begins with a book that I wrote in 2019 that was an oral history of 9/11. The book was called The Only Plane in the Sky, and it brought together the voices of about 480, about just shy of 500 people who experienced that day, uh, morning to night, coast to coast across the United States. And the book came out in 2019, which was, for all of the math wizards in the audience, the 18th anniversary of 9/11. And what struck me there and then, and sort of why I was interested in tackling that project at that moment, was 9/11 was just beginning to slip from living memory into history. That at the 18th anniversary, you had the first college students arriving on campuses across the country born after 9/11. You had the first men and women in the military being deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan to fight in wars that began before they were born. In New York, you had the first firefighter recruits coming into FDNY who were born after the attack. And for sort of a whole host of people at that moment, even those who were just a couple of years old at 9/11, they had been raised in a post 9/11 world, but had never really understood the trauma of that day to the country. And so, what I was interested in doing with that 9/11 book at the 18th anniversary was trying to tell the story of 9/11 for a new generation who did not remember it. And then, as you have already pointed out, last year when this D-Day book came out was the 80th anniversary. And it, to me, sort of represented the other end of the arc of history, which is the 80th anniversary, I think, was such a big deal last year for the world, really, because it was also a moment when we were marking effectively the final passing of the greatest generation. That, there were a million combatants involved in D-Day across the British Isles, on the Allied side, and I think the UK's number is something like a few dozen left alive today. In the United States, I think we're in the hundreds, but still, a very small number compared to the overall size of that engagement. And so for me, at this moment in history, we have effectively every first person memory that we will have of D-Day. And my goal with this book, and why I wanted to tackle it as an oral history, was to try to get that first person experience back into the center of the D-Day story. And so this book is told through the voices and memories of nearly 700 voices, on all sides: British, French, American, Canadian, German, uh, Polish, etc., and so forth. all in the first person, all to try to paint the portrait of D-Day in the voices of those who experienced it at a time when we are losing the last of those voices in living memory, and seeing D-Day again at the other end of that arc where it is now slipping entirely from memory into history.
So Garrett, I mean, through the lens of all of these eyewitness accounts, and not at all in any way meaning to sound flip, because I think we now have our own image of D-Day in our minds, but through the eyes of those people, then why is this such a big deal? What is it about this day? Because you have passages in the book that even then there are these people that are like, this is pretty important.
Yeah. Well, and I think that sort of, to me, again, that's a little bit of the power that you get in the first person of that gets sort of lost or erased in the broader way that we write narrative history about D-Day. And I'm a big fan of narrative history. I've written a ton of narrative history. But I think that there's a tendency often in narrative history to make events seem neater, cleaner, simpler, and more straightforward, and sometimes even preordained than they ever were to the people who were experiencing them in real time. And so, yes, we view D-Day as this enormous triumph. I mean, one of the, great turning points of human history. I mean, in the same way that 9/11 is the most famous single day of the 21st century, I think D-Day stands as the most famous single day of the 20th century, and in fact was voted as such. In I think it was Time magazine at the end of the 1900s. But when you get back to the voices of the people who were experiencing it, when you pull up the letters of the people that they're writing on the ships crossing the English Channel on the night of June 5th, when you go back to the memories of the people who were crammed into, the paratroopers crammed into those transports, heading over in darkness to the French hedgerows, they don't know that they're about to be involved in something that's triumphant. They are scared and young, and they're worried about whether they have what it takes to make it through combat, whether they're going to let down their comrades, whether they're going to live to see the end of the next day. And of course, part of the answer is about 6,000 of them didn't. And so, in some ways, some of the most poignant voices I found in my work were the voices of the people, in those landing craft, in those troop transports who didn't make it to the end of the next day or two.
You touch on the complexity of this event, and I think that's something you can probably talk about for an hour. We may not get another question in, but you include a quote from Andy Rooney early on, and he said, "No one can tell the whole story of D-Day because no one knows it. Each of the 60,000 men who waded ashore that day know a little part of the story too well." 60,000, he's probably talking about the Americans who came across the beach. But that's kind of the nut of D-Day, isn't it? It's a huge number of simultaneous small unit or individual operations. I mean, they're all happening at the same time, and no one's going to have the same story about the day.
Exactly right. And that to me was part of the challenge and the fun of knitting together an entire history of the day and the operation through these individual voices, is the extent to which for most of the people who experience D-Day, it is not the grandest operation in the history of mankind. It is a single foxhole, a single stretch of beach, a single hedgerow, a single landing craft. And that they don't have any sense of where they fit into the overall arc of the day. One of the sort of most interesting sets of quotes are the stories of some of the soldiers, particularly the ones who come ashore after the first couple of waves in the morning, who make it through all of D-Day without firing their rifle once, without ever seeing a German. And sort of they have these like very funny in historical retrospect kind of funny memories of like, for me this was actually like a really boring and weird and strange and incredibly high stress but low stakes day of I made it to shore, I got to shore, didn't see anyone, never fired my rifle, and then dug in on a hedgerow above Omaha Beach or Utah Beach.
Yeah. So, Garrett, the other thing that's kind of interesting is, and it comes out in the quotes, is you have, I would say, a much longer fuse to the telling of the story, right? So, it doesn't start in when Eisenhower becomes commander. It doesn't start in May of 44. When does your story of D-Day start, and why do you start it there?
Yeah. You all are in some ways more deeply steeped in the history of D-Day. So the following comment I will make, it will sound stupid to people who have spent real time on D-Day, but my 9/11 oral history, there's precisely one chapter that comes before 9/11. There's one chapter about September 10th. And I use it to sort of establish some of the characters, some of the voices that you're going to hear. And when I started this D-Day project, I had a sort of similar vision for the book outline. Okay, so D-Day oral history, maybe I start noon on June 5th and have a chapter, and then, chapter 2, you wake up and you're starting to storm the beaches. And as you get into studying and understanding the history of D-Day, what I was really struck by is all of the success of D-Day is laid down weeks, months, and years before anyone actually gets aboard a ship or a paratrooper transport plane on June 4th or 5th. It is in the logistics, it's in the training, it's in the planning, it's in selecting this set of beaches instead of that set of beaches, it's in the deception operations and the air campaigns that target the locomotives instead of the oil fields. And so fully 40% of the book takes place before you actually get to D-Day itself. And to give some sense of the training that takes place, there were actually more American troops killed training for D-Day than in the D-Day invasion itself. And that's not my statistic. It's one that comes from recent work by Peter Caddick Adams in his book Sand and Steel, which is a tremendous other history of D-Day. But you see the units that are engaged in that charge on the morning of June 6th really starting to train for it weeks and months, and in some cases a year or more in advance. And so a big part of this book is about some of those operations and how they unfold. Most infamously, of course, Exercise Tiger, which is the last full-scale dress rehearsal for the American units heading to Utah Beach. And so this is weeks before D-Day, and they're out practicing storming the English coastline, and German PT boats get into the midst of the landing craft in the night and sink two of them, torpedo several of them. And there are more Americans who die that night in Exercise Tiger than died storming Utah Beach. And in fact, sort of part of the history of D-Day is that we actually didn't know anything about Exercise Tiger until relatively recently, until the 1970s and 1980s. And we still don't actually know the final death toll from that event. The sort of the accepted death toll is somewhere in the 700s. But there are rumors that it could be 1,000 or more.
Well, so it's kind of interesting because you wrote about actually Operation Tiger takes place at Slapton Sands, but you again, and I liked Chris's phrase, the long fuse. You didn't start with Operation Tiger. You covered the whole story of how the land was requisitioned, how the people were moved out of their homes, how people had to sell their prized cattle. And it really gave a sense, and I think this, there will be a question at the end of this, but it gave a sense. It gave a sense that of the complexity of the D-Day operation. That just in order to get a practice area, we had to go into all this. And so I thought, my question is, was it sort of a conscious idea of yours as you were working on this book to try to expand the story, to see if you could include a lot more stuff that maybe we wouldn't normally think of as central to our D-Day story?
Yeah, yes, and partly what I was again trying to do was capture what mattered to the people who were involved in this operation. Again, approaching this in the context of trying to tell it through their voices in the first person. And that I think what you see, I think part of a challenge of D-Day, and this is probably something that you guys have wrestled with a lot on this show across previous episodes, is D-Day has now been so entirely swallowed by the mythology of D-Day that I think it's very hard in history to sort of peel back and figure out what the reality of D-Day actually was for the people who were living it. The lionization that we have seen at the 40th anniversary and the 50th anniversary, and last year at the 75th and the 80th, that these are part of this story that we tell is America and the British, we were the best of allies, and this is the best alliance, and the standing up as for freedom and democracy. And really what you see when you get back into the historical record and these first person accounts is how hard it was for that alliance to come together from 1942 to 1944. That yes, we ended up with this incredible alliance, but we spend a lot of 1942, 1943, 1944 learning how to be allies together and learning how to work together as militaries, as personnel, as supply chains. And again, you see that play out in a lot of what takes place in D-Day, because the U.S. has to spend so much of 41, 42, 1943 ramping up its logistics and the industry to supply the ships and the military, the literal size of the military, and getting all of these troops across the Atlantic. And we sort of, I think, forget how transformational that was for the Americans arriving in Britain, but also for the British as the Americans arrived. And I spend a couple of chapters in the book looking at what that American buildup was like, and you see sort of a bunch of different things taking place, because to give you a sense of how big this buildup was, 1/10 of the entire adult male population of Great Britain is Americans by June 1944. And one of the chapters talks about what it was like for America to deliver this segregated army, which it was in World War II, to a country that had no meaningful history of racism against Black people, and the sort of what a eye-opening experience that was for the Black troops arriving, how upsetting that was for some of the white troops arriving to see Black soldiers mingling in pubs happily with British women, the racial tensions that build up across the British Isles across 1943 and 1944. And, for a huge chunk of the people who end up participating in D-Day, it's really that experience of the buildup, and, these farm kids from America, being transported to Britain. And then D-Day itself is this incredibly interesting inflection point for World War II that the British are very conscious of, which is D-Day itself, Operation Overlord, is largely planned by the British. That it is sort of largely a British planning staff. Of course, Ike steps in as the commander, but even that comes, months and years after the British have started the planning. And so it is really not until D-Day itself, it's really not until June 6th that the weight of the resources committed in the European theater begins to tip from the British to the Americans. And it becomes this sort of moment where it's like, I'm oversimplifying this a little bit for podcast happy hour hyperbole, but like June 5th, this is mostly a British war. And then, by the end of June 6th, it is now mostly an American war.
Well, actually, I want to pick up on that and something you'd said earlier about alliances, because when I do D-Day tours, one of the things I always say to my largely American audience is D-Day is not an American victory. And of course, there's the insuck of air in the room, and I get the scowls, and I say, D-Day is an Allied victory. That's how Eisenhower perceived it. And I think that we as Americans tend to fall into this understandable belief that, okay, well, the Americans, Eisenhower leads the troops ashore and they win victory and and we march on from there. But could you talk a little bit about, that idea that it's an Allied victory, that this is, their perception of that and kind of what's going on there?
Yeah. It's a great question, and I couldn't agree with you more. And it's something that I really tried very hard to resurrect, is not exactly the right term, but sort of center in telling this story in the book, because I think, again, in talking about the way that D-Day has been captured by the mythology of D-Day, that in some ways we think of D-Day as the first waves at Omaha Beach. Right. That sort of for America in particular, but I think in some ways for the world at large, D-Day is the first 17 minutes of Saving Private Ryan. And and of course, as you were talking about Andy Rooney's quote and others before, the first 17 minutes of Omaha of Saving Private Ryan is not even reflective of everything that's taking place on Omaha Beach. There's sort of plenty of people who come ashore in those first waves in Omaha Beach who don't exactly have a picnic, but have a very different experience than the people who land at that far western
dog green sector,
dog green sector at the far west of Omaha Beach, where you have sort of the first waves literally entirely wiped out. And when you look at Sword and Gold and the two British beaches and Juneau, the Canadian beach, I think very wrongly there is a sense that those were cakewalks, that they were sort of quiet, waiting ashore, and not only were they quite bloody in certain sectors on those own beaches, but also one of the things that you see, particularly at the British beaches, that I tried to really focus on in Sword and Gold, is in some ways those beaches, those units landing there, had days that were just as bloody as anything that the Americans saw at Omaha Beach, but their fighting was inland, because what was different in Sword and Gold in particular was the beaches were very small, and so they were sort of the British forces got across them very quickly, and then get into and then they get into very intense, heavy fighting off the beach behind the Sword and Gold beaches. Juneau, I worked really hard to try to tell the story of the Canadian forces,
and I appreciated that, Garrett. I just wanted to say that
because I think when you start talking about the British, when you start talking about the alliance, we again shorthand it so much as British and American, but of course, the Canadians had Juneau Beach, and in some ways, that I think in some ways was the most emotional of all of the beaches for the forces storming ashore, because the Canadians had borne the brunt of the disaster at Dieppe, and so for them coming back, they're really the only forces that are coming back to mainland Europe, and so for them it really felt like this is something that is really pushing sort of they're fighting for national history here, and fighting for their fallen comrades. And then, Chris, I think that the one other point that I would make on the alliances that people really, I think, miss is the extent to which these forces were intertwined. That it was, there really wasn't any such thing as British beaches and American beaches and Canadian beaches. That you had, it was British landing craft and British forces who drive the Rangers to drive the American Rangers to Pointe du Hoc. And there are Americans working the landing craft at the British beaches, and there are British working the landing craft at the American beaches. And this was a much, much more allied force. And again, even beyond American, British, and Canadian, I think you guys probably know the number off the top of your head. I think it was 17 different countries are reflected in the naval armada off the shores that day.
Yeah.
I want to remind everybody that we are chatting today with Garrett Graff, who is the author of When the Sea Came Alive, an oral history of D-Day. If you have any questions, please post them up and we'll try to get to them a little later on in the show. You pleased Chris by talking about the
Well, he can
Canadians.
keep talking about him if he wants to.
And you probably pleased Chris, even though we haven't really talked about it today, when you talked about Freddie Morgan, because that's another Chris area. But Chris is now a full-time resident of the UK. So maybe you could talk a little bit about another UK person who's prominently featured in your book. He gained fame initially for charging a bus stop. But he did know so much better about that. But this is Sergeant Stan Hollis. Can you talk a little bit about him and why you wanted to devote some time to him in your book?
Yeah. So Stanley Hollis is the one British soldier who receives the Victoria Cross for his actions on D-Day, and again, trying to tell his story and was one way for me to try to that I was trying to sort of rebalance the history of the American beaches and the British beaches. And I think one of the things that he has this just incredible story. I mean, to get a Victoria Cross, which is the highest medal of valor that Britain gives, you absolutely have to. It's the equivalent of the Medal of Honor for the United States. But I think one of the things that just is so true and challenging about a day like D-Day is when I talk about, for instance, doing oral history, that what I talk about is that you're trying to find the ordinary and the extraordinary. That you're trying. I probably gathered somewhere on the order of about 5,000 personal stories in the course of this research. That many of them oral histories that actually Stephen Ambrose had gathered during his work for his book on D-Day. The records of which are stored at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, which was a huge help for this project. And you're looking for someone who can represent, what was the average experience of someone in a landing craft? What was the average experience of a paratrooper? What was the average experience of someone on a naval ship, off the coast? And then what you're looking for are the extraordinary. You're looking for the voices and the people who have the most atypical, wildest, bravest stories of combat. And what stands out with Stanley Hollis or some of the other stories, I feature the story of a black soldier, Waverly Woodson, at Omaha Beach, who was a medic, who I think is sort of, in the era of racism at the time, is sort of cheated out of his the Medal of Honor that he should receive, which we can talk about separately if you want. But what's just incredible is you have so many stories of people who, if their story had happened on any other day of World War II, in any other conflict, would be among the bravest, wildest, best known stories of World War II. But because of the intensity of D-Day, because of the sheer number of people involved, because of how small D-Day was, for so many of these soldiers in terms of this one stretch of beach, this one foxhole, this one hedgerow, as we talked about, that their stories of bravery and heroism sort of get swallowed by the sheer audacity and courage of that day. And so when you see people like Stanley Hollis, even then, someone like Stanley Hollis really stands out.
Yeah. So, Gary, I mean, speaking of, you were talking about all of the testimonies you gathered, and obviously that's sort of how you tell the story in this book. Lynn Hargrove, one of our longtime viewers, has asked, several eyewitnesses may see things differently. Did you find this to be an issue, particularly in the case of this book, as you're trying to construct the story?
So there's sort of a couple of different ways that this plays out in first person testimonies, right? Like there's sort of people who see the office politics different, which you certainly see among the planners who have different views of each other's competencies, I quote in a couple of places from Lord Alan Brooke's memoirs, or his diaries, which at least according to his diaries, he spent the war thinking that he was surrounded by the giantest group of nincompoops ever assembled.
No one was a genius like Alan Brooke.
Exactly. And he has these incredibly tart comments about the capabilities of literally everyone he sits in meetings with, up to and including Dwight Eisenhower. And then you also see it in obviously the context of people who just remember moments of combat or battles differently, not with any animus necessarily, but with just sort of honest differences of memory. And memory is always fallible. It is particularly so when it comes to traumatic memories of things like who did what at what precise moment in combat. And so one of the things I spent a lot of time with in this book was really trying to line up people's memories as best I could with the known historical record. When did certain units hit what sectors of beach, what ships were available, what ships were involved in which part of the operation. Because particularly with a bunch of the oral histories, what I really saw were people condensing their memories, such that in some instances, on a ship off the coast, they'd be talking about bombarding Utah Beach, and then a sentence or two later be talking about bombarding Omaha Beach, and you'd have to go back and figure out, well, what day were they off Omaha Beach and what day were they off Utah Beach? And I think the broader sense of for me in terms of looking at a project like this in terms of oral history is there are moments in oral history that are true to the participants, even if they are not true to history. And I'll give an example of how this plays out in actually my 9/11 book, which is I have a chapter in the 9/11 book about the DC Air National Guard pilots who are scrambled from Andrews Air Force Base and given the mission to go shoot down United Airlines Flight 93 as it's hijacked on its way to Washington. And they are sent up into the air. Heather Lucky Penny, Mark Sassville, and actually, oddly enough, the new chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff here in the United States, Dan Raising Kane, was part of this unit and part of this operation as well on 9/11. They're sent up without weapons. There's no time to load missiles onto their planes that morning. And so they are sent up on what they believe is a kamikaze mission. They are sent up in with orders basically to crash their plane into hijacked Flight 93 to prevent it from hitting Washington. Now, I got into a dispute in my book, in writing my book, with the 9/11 Commission, which sort of looked into the story of these DC Air National Guard pilots. And what they found, which is accurate, is that these planes did not actually take off until about 10:37 on the morning of 9/11, and that Flight 93 had crashed at 10:02 in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. So Flight 93 was already crashed and off the sort of off the board by the time these pilots make it into the air 35 minutes later. And so from the 9/11 Commission's view, which was writing sort of the strict narrative official history of 9/11, these DC Air National Guard pilots are totally irrelevant because they are not a capable part of the U.S. government's response, and make it seem like the U.S. was actually more competent that day than it actually was. That's not the experience that Heather Lucky Penny and Mark Sassville had on the morning of Tuesday, September the 11th, because they don't know that Flight 93 has crashed when they're being sent up into the air. And so for them, they have this sort of authentic experience of being sent up on a kamikaze mission, even though, we now understand it was irrelevant.
Yeah, that's if you move the camera, you change the whole scene of what you're seeing. I want to bring in another audience question from Dave Borland here. What's his Borland family? I'm assuming it's Dave, but it could be some other Borland who's joining us. What did German defenders think? Did they feel confident, doomed? I remember a German veteran saying something like, "At first light that morning, we saw a whole city coming toward us."
Yeah. So the book, the book's title, "When the Sea Came Alive," is actually a quote from a German defender, and it is just like that listener's quote, in that it's what his reaction to was waking up in one of those bunkers overlooking the beaches, and he looks out and is totally surprised by this massive invasion force that appears out of the morning fog. And his quote was, "We looked out and the sea had come alive." And I think one of the myths that I tried to disentangle in the course of writing this book was this idea that the Atlantic Wall was this completely impenetrable, giant, unbroken fortress that I think we've sort of built up in, and certainly was accurate for the German propaganda as it was issued across, in the months and years leading up to D-Day. But the reality is that the German defenses of the spring of 1944 are not the triumphant, victorious German army that blitzkrieged across Europe in 39 and 40. That the Allied bombing and the sort of shortage of natural resources had reduced a lot of the German army in Normandy to horse-drawn carriages and bicycles by the spring of 1944. And that a lot of the German posts were actually being manned by conscripts, and basically, most of the capable fighters had been pulled by 44 to the Eastern Front, and that a lot of the soldiers on along the Atlantic Wall were sort of the too young, the too old, the slightly injured, or these conscript units. And so, one of the weird things with the Atlantic Wall defenses in the spring of 44, a lot of them are being manned by, Polish, Indians, and in some cases actually Mongolians. There's sort of this amazing section of the book of the puzzlement of these American soldiers who storm ashore, capture some of these bunkers, and are confronted by Asians, and are sort of, who are these people? We were sort of expecting, tall Teutonic German soldiers, and we get Mongolian conscripts.
Yeah.
So, Garrett, as we're getting kind of towards the end, I want to also sort of discuss the process a bit, and kind of what you went through, having spent as much time with the people who were there. You said, I forgot the number, many thousands of interviews you're reading through, and you're going through. What, how much did your perception of that day change, and what, looking after finishing the book, kind of what surprised you? What stands out?
Yeah. You both have spent a lot of time with D-Day, so I think you probably share some of the feelings I'm about to express.
If we don't, we'll let you know.
Yeah. I think one of the things that I came away with, and I've talked a lot about, unpeeling and unraveling the mythology of D-Day. At the same time, I really came away from my study of D-Day believing that D-Day deserves the mythology that has been built up around it. That it is, and I have a lot of quotes to this effect from people who experienced it before and after. The Allied invasion of Europe remains, I think, one of the most noble missions that any fighting force has ever embarked upon in world history. It is unlike almost any other invasion that has ever taken place before or since, because it was an invasion launched not for conquest but for liberation. And it was this attempt to return democracy to the continent of Europe and roll back the totalitarian darkness of the Third Reich. And it was just as audacious as, we all believe it to be. This is, the largest Allied invasion, the largest armada ever assembled anywhere in human history. And, almost certainly because of advances in technology and satellites and things like that, the largest armada and invasion that we will ever see, in the rest of human history. And, the heroism and the planning and the execution is just awe-inspiring. I mean, even the chapters on the logistics of this project I found absolutely fascinating. To me, actually, the most dramatic chapter in the entire book actually is the chapter about the weather reports leading up to D-Day, and sort of this moment where Ike is sitting there basically having to make the go no-go decision on the weekend of June 3rd and 4th. And that decision really falls to him, in this incredibly lonely moment in history, where he has to decide, against what seem at the time pretty daunting weather odds, to go ahead or not. I think what just sort of I kept coming back to in this book was, as much as I, as a student of history, sort of came to D-Day because I was impressed with the audacity and the history and the moment that it represents. Studying D-Day actually makes you even more humbled about all of those experiences, from the very big to the very little.
Yeah.
No, what a great note to end on. Garrett Graff, thank you for joining us. Garrett is the author of When the Sea Came Alive, an Oral History of D-Day. And if you thought this was interesting, Garrett's going to be back in August to talk about his
we can
new
say,
book
what's your next book? Right.
that's coming out. So give us this 30 seconds, no more. Include the title on your book that you're going to come back and talk to us about in August.
Sure. I will be back in August to talk about my new book, which is also a World War II history, also another oral history. The book is called The Devil Reached Toward the Sky, and it is an oral history of the Manhattan Project and the atomic bomb, and the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I won't spoil how World War II ends, and come back in August
And to find out.
All
right. Well,
Excellent.
Garrett, thank you again
Garrett.
so much for joining us. It's been really fun. Appreciate it.
Well, thanks. It's lunch.
It's lunch.
Cheers.
Right hand.
Okay.
Bye.
All right. So next week, Chris, bottoms up. We're off D-Day,
No.
but we're continuing World War II.
I know. We're excited. I'm very excited about next week.
Bring back, and Garrett may become one of our favorite guests, but he still has some ways to go. But we'll bring back one of our favorite guests, Lynn Olson, who's been writing terrific books for nearly 30 years. And she has another one that's coming out on Tuesday, The Sisterhood of Ravensbrück, telling the story of an intrepid band of French women who resist the Nazis in Hitler's all-female concentration camp, not only during the war, but kind of continue their actions after the war. So yeah, it's very exciting. I'm really looking forward to this.
I am too. I was just at Ravensbrück, and it's certainly one of the camps that not a lot of people have talked enough about. So
right, it's sort of it's got a kind of a sense of horror comes to the name, but you don't even exactly know why.
Yeah.
So that should be a really interesting show.
Where are we going to be doing this show from, Rick?
I'll be in June 7th,
June 7th,
or June 8th.
Yes.
June 8th. I think I'll still be in Normandy. Where will you be?
I will be in Lisbon.
You'll be in Lisbon. You won't be on the cruise ship yet.
No, but that's
eventually our paths are going to.
Yeah. Julie McCoy is going to get Rick and I together in a room.
Collide at sea.
Let's hope not. Let's hope not.
I bought some clip-on mics so we can do a little informal video.
Well, you said something about you were going to stand on the bow with arms outstretched with the wind blowing in your
I'll just do it
hair
right here. I'm the king of the world.
Different.
No,
yeah,
okay,
wrong movie.
Sorry.
Yeah,
all right, guys. Thank you so much for joining us today. Please subscribe to us on YouTube. Follow us on Facebook. Shout at us on Blue Sky. Listen to our podcast. Back us on Patreon and browse historyhappyhour.com.
Thanks, everybody. Be safe.